here's the Greek recording, the Greek screencast. I'm going to keep this in this mode because it seems to work the cursor better. And first off, just notice this is what we mean by Greek, right? We get stuck talking about over here, right, with what's coming out of the sort of the big area of Greece, but it's really all of this stuff is the same sort of culture. They travel around by boat a lot. Word gets around. People still have fidelity to their particular city-state, right? And we're going to talk about Sparta here in a second. But for the most part, we're talking about the shared story, shared culture with all this, and this is what we were talking about last night. Troy is up here when they're sailing across the sea and all that. So it's very fragmented, right? We tend to, we like to think of things in contrast. The biggest contrast to this time, Athens and Sparta, right? So as we look at we want to take a couple of background things into consideration. Does not mean it's reducible to a determinism, as people like to call it, a historical determinism. I don't view it as that. It's just a background pressure, if you will, that will tend to do some things in some time periods, and other time periods may do different things, sometimes the opposite. Right? So the soil in Sparta. Right? Soil in Sparta was good, unlike Athens. Athens didn't have that great a soil. So and remember we talked about how great the Egyptian soil was. Well, for Sparta, they had the good stuff. They had plenty of food, right, for the most part. Right? So staple annual grains. Remember how we talked about how people started staying in one place? Mostly with staple annual grains, the earlier versions of wheat, barley, rye, hops, all that sort of stuff, right? So their attitude, the Spartan attitude toward this is protect what you have. If you've got it, protect it. They, in fact, enslaved a whole group of people that they used to pronounce war on, every 7 years, just to kind of keep them in check, remain militant, all that sort of stuff. And if you remember, the Spartans, people, very military lifestyle, separate basically the strong ones from the weak ones, right? So the things that you kind of saw in the movie where they go and a baby with a defects, for instance, they would let it go, right? Drop it off a cliff, sort of get it out of the community, let it die is the idea. Don't spoil the tribe or something like that. Hard people. They would do things such as before little boys could sort of, truly get incorporated into the Spartan society, they'd put them out on their own and make them steal and so forth to survive. All that sort of thing, right? So this was very different than the soil in Athens, which was not good for much except for the crops that really seemed to thrive in Athens. They had excellent olives, so therefore olive oil. Olive oil is incredibly important in the ancient world for all sorts of stuff, and wine, right? Both because people like wine, and also remember that the alcohol in it would tend to kill what we would call bacteria. They didn't really know that at the time. They diluted wine, usually half and half with water, but it still served as a way to drink a clean liquid supply, right? But olive oil, lots of uses for olive oil. They'd put wicks in a tub of it, and it'd come out, light one end of it, get really artistic with it. Sometimes, if you've ever seen some of the Gladiator movies, including, I think it was his last recent series on Stars, was Spartacus, where people would clean themselves with olive oil, right? And there are these kind of scrapers that look kind of like skice that you would harvest wheat in, except much smaller. It'd go kind of right around your arm, not sharp on what we would think of as the cutting edge, not sharp there, but enough to where if you rubbed olive oil into your arm at the end of the day, then you could take that and kind of press out the dirt. The oil would grab the dirt and so on. People would anoint their heads, right? Just remember Messiah in the Old Testament anointed one, probably with olive oil, right? People, our heads now are different. Like a lot of other things we talked about in terms of the oil production on your head, right? If you actually were to sort of reverse what we do, not shampoo for a while, your very overactive glands for most people, most people's heads would settle down, and you would go back to a kind of more natural. Well, so at times when people had longer hair, it was somewhat good that they like put a little extra oil in their hair. What this tended to mean for Athens, you tended to have powerful form of the olive. People who controlled olive trees, oftentimes on these kind of plateaus that were difficult to get to, right? A lot of people theorize that maybe this is the beginning of democracy. This, in essence, the moneyed people, based off of property in this case, and controlling the olives on this and the wine, the grapes on this. Maybe this is the beginning of democracy. We're not going to get into all that. I'll just note that some people talk about this. But because they did not have staple annual grains, the Athenians had to trade for staple annual grains, sometimes with the Spartans, right from before, but the Spartans tended to be a more closed society, so the Athenians would go all over the place, including Egypt, right? And so as a background pressure again, Athenians tended to not go into Egypt by nature of what they needed. They didn't get off the boat and say, wow, you people, the sun god, that's ridiculous. You need to get right with Zeus and all this sort of stuff. That's not the Athenian attitude at all. It's more like, wow, hey, you do what? I mean, what does that mean? This Ra, and that sort of sounds like this one god we have, and so on. You do what for entertainment here? Well, that sounds fun. We do this. Well, we get together in groups and that sort of thing, right? And then after you trade, get a good trading relationship and go back, right? So they're more open by nature, right? Open to new ideas and different cultures and all that sort of stuff, right? This becomes a very sort of Western hallmark, right? For time, sometimes it'll kind of retract and then come back. City-states. Remember from the up here, more loose, it's very difficult to control, and impossible for long durations, really. To control that takes a very threatening enemy to unite, such as the Persians, which come in. And remember, this is what we were talking about with the vein of silver that they found, right? They had the first major battle in 490, and the second, this is the one that's really won independence for the area, truly sustainable independence, Salamis. Right, this is the one the 300, the Spartans were about. Salamis is the naval one. That was the second one. I never watched that one. I'm not sure whether that was any good or not. But this was the idea here. That the kind of ships that they built this is a recreation, obviously. It looked something like this. These are very, very different than the sort of clunker troop transports that the Persians carry around, which tended to be a lot heavier. Right, so it would have a deep draft, very difficult to kind of turn on a dime, turn around, big, bulky, but carried a lot of people. These, you can even see here, the draft is very shallow in the boat, which means that they can maneuver a lot easier, right, because don't have a big keel to turn, but also they can go in and sort of hide out, as it were, in shallower places in the ocean, right? Besides the draft, they've got all these oars coming out for a boat that, relatively speaking, doesn't weigh that much, right? So they can turn it way faster than the competition. And then what the basic plan was, this typical Greek stuff, they were really sneaky about how they killed the Persians. And so what they did, there was this bay that was, you had to sort of go around a corner to get to see what was in it. And one of the things that they did was they planted a spy, and I heard this showed up in the movie, who pretended to defect and go to the Persians, right? And he pretended, he did the con basically well enough to where he convinced the Persians that the Greeks had run, right? And they were just around, like the remaining remnant, right, was just around the corner of this bay. So the Persians, the Navy, or the waterborne anyway, I guess we'll call it the Navy, although it was largely troop transport, fighting ships too, They went into this bay, and then the remaining part of the Greeks, there were some in the bay, and the remaining part closed the door on them on the backside. So after all the Persian ships got in, so they locked in a bunch of big, bulky ships that were hard to maneuver, and now there's just a whole lot of them in one place, which makes it even more difficult. And then they just rammed the bejesus out of them with these rams that they would actually paint like this. Right? We even did stuff like this in the Persian Gulf War, where people would sort of paint on the tubes after the tomahawks went off and things like that. It's just a thing people do. They did in World War II. This is really sort of common if you've ever seen some pictures of that on the bombers and so forth. All right, and they'd sunk the ships, right? And as surprising as this sounds to us, it seems a little bit weird, but most people in the ancient world cannot swim, right? Especially if they're coming from the Persian area, right? So we're conscripted somewhere on land, right? Some of them could, but most people couldn't, right? So a lot of people just drowned to start out with. They're wearing stuff that's too heavy too. And of the people that were able to make it to shore, also very well thought out by the Athenians, and they got into league with other people. These other city-states kind of united for a while. And around that bay, had people lined up with swords and just killed anybody that was able to swim to shore after, exhaust themselves, walk up, and they're dead anyway. They just turned that whole bay into a pool of blood, basically. But that battle set off, it was an incredibly important battle for the history of Western civilization. If that battle goes the other way, we probably are not sitting where we're sitting, like I said last night, or things turn out very, very differently. We're talking about very different stuff, as it were. All right, so this sets off the golden age in Greece. All the kind of stuff we covered last night with the theater, philosophy, culture, all this, that for a time, and it wasn't for that long, but for a time it was great. And here the theater of Dionysius. Right? So this is the actual Acropolis up here. This is what I was talking about. This is the thing the Turks blew up, the Parthenon, that was later erected. And you can see, this is a better visual for what I was talking about, in that you can see how this stretch of land, even though, computer recreation is incredibly difficult to control, right? If you can come up here and camp out with enough supplies, you can just outlast somebody, because the best way up, and think about way back in the day, you can see the kind of road going up here, but way back in the day, that's before you even really had a proper road, right? So do you really want to try, if you're the enemy trying to, way back, trying to take this tribe of people out, and they've retreated up here with provisions, you can wait them out, try to make them starve. This part of it is incredibly difficult to get up. Same sort of thing all around here. So maybe it starts opening up a little bit here. Everybody's forced into a chute, right? Well, that's where all their stuff's going to be concentrated as far as raining down on them, right? So a good, secure position, right? That they, much later built the temple to Athena on top of here. The theater, notice you can throw a rock from the top here and hit the temple of Dionysius. This is a little bit more complicated than the one we talked about last night. It's bigger, it seats more people. Same idea applies with the people on the small stilts, or the Prince Hills, as I was calling them. And what was kind of cool here, you've heard the phrase God from the machine, God out of the machine. They actually did some. This is where they get it from. It's this actual theater. They had a little crane-like device based off of pulleys, because remember, no motors, no powers. But they didn't know about pulleys and how to get heavy stuff up. So every once in a while, when the play called for it from back here, they'd do their version of they put on a god or a goddess. They'd tie it with ropes, the actor, lift up the person. There was in front of the skene here, this front part of the theater, come up over the ramparts here. The god would come down, and the whole direction of the play would change, basically. All right, so God from the machine, right? If you ever hear that again, this is what it's referring to. Notice how this whole area, as we were talking about last night, it's not really that large, right? But we're used to Texas, we're used to Dallas and all that sort of stuff. Cowboy Stadium, no one in history, I think somebody finally surpassed him, But Jerry had the biggest screen for several years there in Cowboys. That's incredibly large, right? It would take up all this space here. But for the day, right, this is pretty big. And this is just after it. That's not the Theater Dionysius. This is, I forget the city in North Africa somewhere, but this is deteriorated. This is the kind of Greek culture. When we're talking about spreading Hellenistic culture into other civilizations. Some civilizations kind of like it, going along with it fun. Other cultures, not so much, as we were talking about. And we're going to see the after effects of a lot of this stuff. And the Romans especially after are going to try to do the same thing. Romans are actually a lot better in terms of how they orchestrated these exchanges with different cultures than the Greeks were. And that takes us to the end of this. They pride the individual over the group. Remember, that's a key takeaway, right? Most tribes didn't at the time. This is what dominates. This is what we're used to. But this is not necessarily, when you get in the ancient world, this is the minority, right? Questioning and curious nature. Personal freedom. These two are big ones. Remember, we're talking about mostly for the important people in society. And this idea that you could vote. If it all comes down, the leaders at the time just put it to a vote, right? If it's something really critical. These are themes we will return to. And in a nutshell, these are a few of the reasons why the Greeks are important. Make sure you look and get your 3B response done. Shouldn't be too awful difficult. And we'll probably start branching out after next week in the responses. Going to be about the same thing for this one and the next one, I think.